The yellow cab carved through Montana dust like a blade, its engine coughing to silence before a gate that had seen better decades. She emerged in ivory silk and pearl buttons, her wedding dress a stark contrast to the weathered wood and rusted hinges surrounding her. The invitation trembled between manicured fingers, pink cardstock promising elegance, now mocking her with its pristine perfection. Meadowbrook Wedding Venue, it read, but the faded sign ahead whispered different truths. Broken Creek Ranch. From within the shadows of a sagging porch came a sound that pierced the afternoon stillness. An infant's cry, raw and desperate, echoing like a prayer unanswered. The screen door groaned open. A man stepped into the dying sunlight, his tall frame carved by exhaustion, shirt stained with the evidence of sleepless nights and single fatherhood. When their eyes met across the dusty courtyard, time fractured. His voice broke the sacred silence. God finally sent you to us. But heaven had made no such promise, and fate had written no such script. The cab driver shifted uncomfortably in his seat, engine still running like a nervous heartbeat. "This ain't looking like no wedding venue, miss," he muttered, but his words dissolved into Montana wind. The woman stood frozen, her train spreading behind her like spilled milk on dirt that hadn't seen rain in weeks. The baby's cries intensified, each wail cutting through the September heat with surgical precision. The man on the porch swayed slightly, his weathered hands gripping the railing as if it were the only thing anchoring him to earth. Dark stubble shadowed his jaw, and his eyes held the hollow look of someone who had forgotten what hope felt like. When he spoke again, his voice cracked like autumn leaves. "I've been praying for help, and here you are." The woman's lips parted, but no sound emerged. Her designer heels sank into the soft earth as she took an involuntary step forward, drawn by something she couldn't name. The crying from inside the house grew more frantic, and she watched the man's shoulders tense with each desperate sob. His shirt sleeves were rolled up, revealing forearms marked by scratches and burns, the battle scars of a man fighting a war he was losing. The screen door hung open behind him like a mouth gasping for air, and through it she could glimpse the chaos within. Baby bottles scattered on a coffee table, laundry draped over chairbacks, the debris of a life barely held together. Something stirred in her chest, a recognition she couldn't explain. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the infant's cries. "I think I'm in the wrong place." But even as the words left her lips, her feet remained planted in the dusty earth. The man's face shifted, hope flickering in his tired eyes like a candle in a draught. He descended the porch steps slowly, each movement careful and deliberate, as if sudden gestures might shatter the fragile moment. The baby's wailing reached a crescendo, and his step quickened. "Please," he said, and the single word carried the weight of 1,000 sleepless nights. "I don't know what to do anymore." His admission hung between them like smoke, acrid and real. The screen door slammed shut in the wind, the sound sharp as a gunshot. Inside, the crying stopped abruptly, replaced by an ominous silence that made both adults freeze. The man's face went white beneath his tan. "Rose," he breathed, and suddenly he was moving, his long legs carrying him toward the house in swift, panicked strides. Without thinking, the woman gathered her skirts and followed, her heels clicking against the wooden steps like a countdown. The interior of the house hit her like a physical force, the smell of sour milk and unwashed laundry, the oppressive heat of a home where windows stayed closed and air conditioning was a luxury they couldn't afford. The man disappeared down a narrow hallway, his boots thundering against worn floorboards. She stood in the doorway, her wedding dress a ridiculous beacon of white in the dim chaos. Children's toys were scattered across the floor like the remnants of a small hurricane, and empty formula cans formed a metallic mountain beside an overflowing trash bag. Through the kitchen doorway, she could see dishes stacked in precarious towers, evidence of meals grabbed in haste between diaper changes and midnight feedings. The silence stretched taut as a wire, broken only by the man's urgent whispers from the back room. Her hand smoothed the silk of her skirt without conscious thought, a nervous gesture that spoke of anxiety and uncertainty. This wasn't how her day was supposed to unfold. "She's burning up!" came his voice from the hallway, rough with fear. The words hit her like cold water, washing away the surreal quality of the moment and replacing it with sharp, immediate concern. She found herself moving toward the sound, her dress rustling against the narrow walls like autumn leaves. In a small bedroom decorated with faded zoo animals, she found him bent over a wooden crib, his large hands gentle as butterfly wings as he touched the forehead of a little girl who couldn't have been more than 2 years old. The child's cheeks were flushed red as summer roses, her blonde hair damp with perspiration. Her breathing came in quick, shallow puffs that made her tiny chest rise and fall like a hummingbird's wings. "How long has she been like this?" The question left her lips before she could stop it, and the man's head snapped up, surprise flickering across his features. Up close, she could see the deep lines carved around his eyes, the premature grey threading through his dark hair, the slight tremor in his hands that spoke of too much coffee and too little sleep. "Since this morning," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "She was fine when I put her down for her nap. But when I went to check on her—" His words trailed off, but his fear filled the silence like water rushing into a broken dam. The little girl stirred restlessly, a soft whimper escaping her fevered lips. Without conscious thought, the woman stepped closer to the crib. Her hands, which had been shaking moments before, steadied as some deeper instinct took hold. "Have you taken her temperature?" she asked, her voice calmer than she felt. The man nodded toward a digital thermometer on the dresser, its display showing numbers that made her stomach clench. 103, he said, the words falling like stones into still water. "I don't know if I should call the doctor, or take her to the emergency room, or—" His voice cracked, and she watched him struggle to maintain composure in front of a stranger. The little girl's breathing hitched, and both adults held their breath until the rhythm steadied again. "What's her name?" she asked softly, reaching out to touch the child's forehead with the back of her hand. The skin was dry and hot, like touching a sun-baked stone. "Rose," he whispered, and something in the way he said it made her look up sharply. His eyes were fixed on his daughter's face with an intensity that spoke of pure, undiluted love mixed with terror. "She's all I have left," he added, so quietly she almost missed it. The admission hung in the air between them, heavy with implication and loss. The woman found herself wondering about the mother who wasn't there, about the story that had led to this moment of desperate solitude. "My name's Isabella," she said, though she wasn't sure why it mattered in this moment of crisis. The man's gaze flicked to her briefly, taking in the wedding dress that seemed so absurd in this setting. "Caleb Rivers," he replied automatically, then immediately returned his attention to Rose. The little girl's eyelids fluttered, and for a moment her gaze focused on Isabella's face with the startling clarity that sometimes comes with fever. Her lips moved soundlessly, as if she were trying to speak, and Isabella felt something twist in her chest. The child's eyes were the same deep blue as her father's, but where his held exhaustion and worry, hers held a vulnerability that made Isabella's throat tighten. The afternoon light filtering through the bedroom window caught the dust motes dancing in the air, creating an almost ethereal quality to the scene. Isabella's dress rustled as she bent closer to the crib, her voice dropping to barely more than a breath. "Hola, pequeña," she murmured, the Spanish words flowing naturally despite herself. Rose's eyes seemed to track the sound, and her restless movement stilled slightly. Caleb's head jerked up, surprise and something else. Hope, maybe, flickering across his features. "You speak Spanish?" he asked, and there was a note in his voice she couldn't quite identify. Isabella nodded, then began to hum softly, a lullaby her own mother had sung to her years ago in what felt like another lifetime. The melody seemed to have an almost magical effect on Rose. Her labored breathing evened out slightly, and the flush in her cheeks appeared to lessen just a fraction. Caleb watched in amazement as his daughter's tiny fist unclenched, her fever-bright eyes tracking Isabella's face with growing calm. "How did you—" he started to ask, but Isabella shook her head slightly, not wanting to break the spell. She continued humming, her voice weaving through the afternoon air like silk thread, binding the three of them together in a moment that felt suspended outside of time. The wedding dress that had seemed so out of place now felt like a costume from another play entirely. Rose's breathing deepened, settling into a more natural rhythm, though the fever still painted roses on her pale cheeks. Isabella's humming gradually faded to silence, leaving only the sound of the wind outside and the distant lowing of cattle. Caleb's eyes never left his daughter's face, but she could feel his awareness of her presence like heat from a fire. "She's never done that before," he said finally, his voice filled with wonder. "Gotten calm like that with a stranger." The word stranger seemed to echo in the small room, highlighting the surreal nature of their situation. A woman in a wedding dress, appearing like an answer to a prayer he hadn't quite finished praying. "We should get her fever down," Isabella said, surprising herself with the authority in her voice. Caleb nodded eagerly, looking like a drowning man who had just been thrown a rope. "I have children's acetaminophen in the kitchen," he said, already moving toward the door. "But she won't take it. Spits it out every time I try." Isabella watched him go, then turned back to Rose, whose blue eyes were still fixed on her face with that unsettling intensity. The little girl's lips moved again, forming what might have been words or might have been fever dreams. The afternoon sun slanted through the window, casting long shadows across the crib, and Isabella felt as though she had stepped through a door into someone else's life entirely. When Caleb returned with the medicine bottle and a plastic syringe, Isabella was still standing beside the crib, her presence seeming to provide some invisible comfort to the feverish child. "Let me try," she said quietly, accepting the syringe from his slightly trembling hands. Their fingers brushed in the exchange, and she noticed the calluses on his palms, the small cuts and scrapes that spoke of manual labor and constant work. Rose watched the syringe approach with the wary eyes of someone who had fought this battle before, but when Isabella began humming again, softly, under her breath, the little girl's mouth opened slightly. The medicine went down without protest, and both adults exhaled in relief. "I don't understand," Caleb said, his voice rough with emotion. "She fights me every time, screams and carries on until we're both exhausted." He ran his hands through his hair, leaving it even more disheveled than before. You just appear here, and suddenly everything's different." His eyes searched Isabella's face as if looking for answers to questions he didn't know how to ask. The wedding dress rustled as she shifted her weight, and his gaze flicked down to the silk and lace, then back up to her face with growing confusion. "Why are you here?" he asked finally. "Really, why are you here?" The question hung between them like a bridge neither was quite ready to cross. Isabella's hand smoothed her skirt again, that nervous gesture returning as the weight of her real situation pressed down on her shoulders. Outside, she could hear the taxi driver's radio crackling with static, and she realized he was still waiting, still running his meter, still expecting her to emerge and direct him to the correct venue. But the thought of leaving this little girl, of walking away from this moment of strange connection, felt wrong in a way she couldn't articulate. "I was supposed to be somewhere else," she said finally, the admission coming out barely above a whisper. Caleb's expression shifted, understanding dawning slowly like sunrise. "The wedding," he said, and it wasn't a question. Isabella nodded, not trusting her voice. "Your wedding," he continued, and this time she couldn't nod, couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The silence stretched between them, filled with all the things that couldn't be said, while Rose dozed fitfully in her crib, oblivious to the adult complexities swirling around her small, fevered form. The afternoon light was beginning to fade, casting longer shadows across the room and highlighting the surreal nature of the tableau they had created. A runaway bride, a desperate father, and a sick child who seemed to be the only one at peace. The taxi driver's voice carried through the open windows, impatient now and growing louder. "Lady, we need to get moving if you're going to make that 2 o'clock ceremony." The words hit Isabella like cold water, reminding her of the world outside this little bedroom, the world of expectations and obligations and carefully laid plans. But when she looked down at Rose, now sleeping more peacefully than she had since Isabella's arrival, those obligations felt as distant as stars. Caleb was watching her face, reading the conflict there with the intuition of someone who understood difficult choices. "You should go," he said quietly, though his voice lacked conviction. Your groom will be waiting." The word seemed to stick in his throat, and Isabella wondered what he saw when he looked at her. A bride running late to her own happiness? Or something else entirely? She opened her mouth to agree, to thank him for letting her help and to wish him luck with Rose's fever, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she found herself asking, "Do you have anyone? Anyone who helps you with her?" The question seemed to surprise him, and his eyes flickered with something that might have been pain. "It's just us," he said simply, and those 3 words contained a universe of loneliness. "Has been since Jenny." He stopped, unable or unwilling to finish the sentence, but the past tense told Isabella everything she needed to know. The absence in the house suddenly made sense. The single coffee cup in the kitchen sink, the way he moved through the space with the careful efficiency of someone accustomed to doing everything alone, the desperate gratitude in his voice when she had appeared. Rose stirred in her crib, and both adults froze, waiting to see if she would wake, but she settled back into sleep with a soft sigh. "The driver's getting impatient," Isabella said, though she made no move toward the door. Through the window she could see the yellow taxi, its engine running, exhaust shimmering in the afternoon heat. The sight of it made her stomach clench with anxiety, but not for the reasons she expected. She wasn't worried about missing her ceremony, about disappointing the guests or the groom who waited for her at an altar she had never wanted to approach. Instead, she was worried about leaving this place, this moment, this unexpected connection that felt more real than anything she had experienced in months. Caleb studied her face with growing intensity, as if he were trying to solve a puzzle written in a language he didn't quite understand. "Why do you look like you're afraid to go?" he asked finally, his voice gentle but direct. The question hit her like a physical blow, and she felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. She had been running for so long from expectations and obligations and a future that felt like a cage that she had forgotten what it felt like to stand still, to be present in a moment that actually mattered. Rose made a small sound in her sleep, and Isabella's hand moved instinctively to smooth the little girl's damp hair. "Because," she whispered, the admission torn from somewhere deep in her chest, "this is the first time in months that I've felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be." The words hung in the air between them, raw and honest and completely unexpected. Caleb's eyes widened, and she saw her own surprise reflected there. She hadn't meant to say that, hadn't meant to reveal so much, but the truth had spilled out like water from a broken dam. Outside, the taxi driver honked his horn once, sharply, and the sound made them both jump. "Miss!" came his voice through the open window, tinged with irritation. "I got other fares waiting. We need to move." But Isabella's feet remained rooted to the worn floorboards beside Rose's crib, her wedding dress pooling around her like spilled cream. Caleb was still watching her face, and she could see the exact moment when understanding dawned in his eyes. "You're not just late," he said quietly. "You're running." It wasn't a question, and Isabella found herself nodding before she could stop herself. The admission felt like stepping off a cliff, terrifying and liberating in equal measure. "I can't marry him," she said, the words tumbling out in a rush. "I thought I could. Thought it was the right thing, the smart thing. But I can't." Her hands were shaking now, and she clasped them together to still the tremor. "When I saw this place, when I heard Rose crying, when I saw you—" She trailed off, unable to articulate the feeling that had overwhelmed her the moment she stepped out of that taxi. Caleb took a step closer, his movements careful and deliberate, as if approaching a wounded animal. "When you saw me what?" he asked softly, and Isabella met his eyes directly for the first time since entering the house. In them, she saw understanding, compassion, and something else that made her breath catch in her throat. "When I saw you, I remembered what it felt like to want to help someone," she said. "To be needed for something that actually mattered." The taxi driver honked again, longer this time, and she could hear him muttering curse words through his open window. But the sound felt distant, unimportant, like noise from another world entirely. Rose stirred again, her fever-flushed face turning toward Isabella's voice even in sleep. The simple gesture sent a wave of protectiveness through Isabella's chest, so strong it nearly knocked her off balance. "She's beautiful," she whispered, reaching out to touch the little girl's soft cheek. "She looks like you." Caleb's breath caught, and when Isabella looked up, she saw tears standing in his eyes. "She looks like her mother," he corrected quietly. "Jenny. She died in a car accident when Rose was 6 months old." The words fell into the space between them like stones into deep water, creating ripples that spread outward and changed everything. "I'm sorry," Isabella breathed, and meant it with every fiber of her being. She had known there was a story, had felt the weight of loss in the house's atmosphere, but hearing it spoken aloud made it real in a way that tore at her heart. Caleb nodded, his throat working as he struggled with emotion. "It's been 18 months, he said. 18 months of trying to figure out how to be everything she needs, and failing most of the time." His voice cracked on the last words, and Isabella watched him fight to maintain control. The taxi driver's honking had stopped, replaced by the sound of his footsteps on the front porch. "Lady?" came his voice through the house, closer now and edged with annoyance. "You in there? We got a wedding to get to." His words shattered the intimate atmosphere of the bedroom like a rock through glass. Isabella straightened, her trained responses kicking in automatically. But when she looked down at Rose's sleeping face, her resolve wavered again. The little girl had wrapped her tiny fingers around Isabella's thumb at some point, and the contact felt like an anchor holding her to this moment, this place, this unexpected sense of purpose. "Tell him to go," Caleb said quietly, and Isabella's head snapped up in surprise. His eyes were steady on hers, filled with a certainty that took her breath away. "Tell him to leave and stay here with us." The simple request carried the weight of a lifetime's worth of loneliness and hope, and Isabella felt something inside her chest crack open like an egg. "I can't ask you to do that," she whispered. But even as she spoke, she was memorizing every detail of Rose's face, every line of worry around Caleb's eyes, every dust mote dancing in the afternoon light. "You're not asking," he said, taking another step closer until she could smell the honest scent of his work shirt, see the gold flecks in his brown eyes. "I am." The taxi driver's voice grew louder, more impatient, and Isabella heard his footsteps moving through the house, getting closer to the bedroom where this impossible moment was unfolding. "I don't know anything about you," she said desperately, as if cataloguing the obstacles might make the decision easier. "And you don't know anything about me." But even as she spoke, she knew it wasn't true. In the space of an hour, she had seen more of his heart than most people revealed in years. "I know you appeared when I needed you most," Caleb said simply. "I know Rose stopped crying when you held her. I know you're running from something that doesn't make you happy, towards something that scares you to death." Each word hit her like a gentle blow, accurate and devastating in its simplicity. "And I know that in 27 years on this earth, I have never seen anyone look at my daughter the way you just did." His voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "Like she mattered, like she was yours to protect." The taxi driver appeared in the bedroom doorway, his face red with exertion and annoyance. "There you are! Lady, I don't know what kind of game you're playing, but I got a schedule to keep. You coming or not?" His presence in the intimate space felt like a violation, and Isabella saw Caleb's jaw tighten as he moved slightly, instinctively placing himself between the stranger and his sleeping daughter. The gesture was so purely protective, so unconsciously male, that Isabella felt her last defenses crumble. She looked at the driver, then at Rose's peaceful face, then at Caleb's steady, hopeful eyes. "Go," she said to the taxi driver, her voice stronger than she felt. "Tell them—" She paused, searching for words that could possibly explain what was happening here. "Tell them the bride changed her mind." The driver's face went through several expressions: confusion, disbelief, and finally resignation. "Lady, you sure about this? That's one hell of an expensive cab ride for nothing." But Isabella was already reaching into her small clutch purse, pulling out bills with hands that barely shook. "Here," she said, pressing the money into his palm. "For your trouble." The driver counted the bills, his eyebrows rising at the generous amount, then shrugged with the philosophical acceptance of someone who had seen every variety of human behavior. "Your funeral, lady," he said, but not unkindly. "Literally, maybe, when whoever's waiting for you finds out." He tipped his cap and headed back through the house, muttering about crazy brides and Montana dust. They heard the front door slam, followed by the sound of the taxi's engine growing fainter as it pulled away from Broken Creek Ranch. The silence that followed felt enormous, filled with possibility and terror in equal measure. Isabella looked down at her wedding dress, at the silk and pearls and careful stitching that had cost more than most people made in a month. It felt like a costume now, like something worn by an actress playing a role she no longer wanted to inhabit. "I can't stay dressed like this," she said, and the practical concern made Caleb smile for the first time since she had arrived. The expression transformed his face, erasing years of worry and revealing the handsome man he must have been before loss carved its lines around his eyes. "I think Jenny's clothes are still in the closet," he said quietly. "You're about the same size." The offer hung between them, loaded with implications neither was quite ready to examine. Accepting his dead wife's clothes felt like crossing a line, like stepping fully into this new reality instead of keeping one foot in the world she had abandoned. But the wedding dress felt increasingly like a lie, a beautiful prison she was finally ready to shed. "Are you sure?" she asked, and Caleb nodded, his eyes serious but kind. "She would have liked you," he said simply. "She would have wanted to help." The certainty in his voice made Isabella's throat tighten with emotion she couldn't name. Rose stirred in her crib, making soft sounds that indicated she was beginning to wake. Her fever seemed to have broken slightly, though her cheeks were still flushed with telltale roses. When her blue eyes opened and focused on Isabella's face, she smiled, a real, genuine expression of recognition and pleasure that went straight to Isabella's heart like an arrow. "Hey there, little one," Isabella whispered, and Rose made happy sounds in response, reaching up with her small arms in the universal gesture that meant, "Pick me up." Isabella looked at Caleb for permission, and when he nodded, she lifted the little girl from her crib. Rose settled against Isabella's shoulder with a contentment that surprised them both. Her fever-warm body relaxed completely, her breathing evening out in a way that spoke of complete trust and comfort. Caleb watched in amazement as his daughter, who was usually shy and clingy with strangers, seemed to melt into Isabella's embrace. "She knows," he said wonderingly. "Somehow she knows you're safe." Isabella felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes as Rose's tiny hand tangled in her hair, the gesture so natural and right it took her breath away. This was what she had been searching for without knowing it, this feeling of being needed, wanted, essential to someone's happiness. "What happens now?" Isabella asked, the question encompassing everything: the wedding she had abandoned, the life she had walked away from, the impossible situation she found herself in. Caleb was quiet for a long moment, his eyes moving between Isabella's face and his daughter's contented form in her arms. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady but soft. "Now we figure it out," he said. "One day at a time. 1 hour at a time if we have to." Rose made a soft sound of agreement, as if she understood and approved of this plan. The afternoon sun was beginning to set, casting the bedroom in golden light that made everything seem possible. "I should call someone," Isabella said, though the thought of explaining her decision to her family, to her abandoned groom, to the wedding guests who were probably wondering where she was, made her stomach clench with anxiety. Caleb nodded toward the old rotary phone on the dresser. "Whenever you're ready," he said. "But maybe get out of that dress first. Have some coffee. Let yourself breathe for a minute." His voice held the wisdom of someone who had learned to take life one crisis at a time, and Isabella felt some of the tension in her shoulders ease. Rose had fallen back to sleep in Isabella's arms, her breathing deep and even, her fever continuing to break. The little girl's trust was absolute, her body completely relaxed against Isabella's chest, as if she had been waiting her entire short life for exactly this person to hold her. Isabella looked down at the sleeping child, then up at Caleb, who was watching them both with an expression of wonder and gratitude, and something deeper that made her pulse quicken. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for letting me stay, for not asking questions I'm not ready to answer." "Thank you," he replied, his voice rough with emotion, "for showing up when we needed you most, for being the answer to a prayer I was too scared to pray." The honesty in his words wrapped around Isabella like a warm blanket, and for the first time in months, she felt like she was exactly where she belonged. Outside, the Montana sky was painting itself in shades of amber and rose, and somewhere in the distance, she could hear the lowing of cattle and the whisper of wind through tall grass. This was real, she realized. This moment, this man, this child in her arms, this was more real than anything she had left behind. As the golden hour settled over Broken Creek Ranch, Isabella stood in a bedroom that smelled of baby powder and honest work, holding a sleeping child who had claimed her heart in the space of an afternoon, while a man who understood loss and hope in equal measure watched them both with eyes that held the promise of tomorrow. The wedding dress that had felt like a beautiful prison now seemed like nothing more than silk and thread, pretty but ultimately meaningless. What mattered was the weight of the child in her arms, the steady presence of the man beside her, and the growing certainty that sometimes the best decisions were the ones that made no sense at all. The sun dipped lower toward the horizon, painting the ranch in shades of gold and amber that seemed to transform everything they touched. Isabella felt Rose's breathing deepen against her chest, felt Caleb's presence beside her like warmth from a fire, and knew with absolute certainty that she had finally found her way home. Not to a place, but to a purpose. Not to a plan, but to a love she hadn't known she was capable of feeling. The woman who had stepped out of that yellow taxi in her wedding dress was gone, replaced by someone braver, someone willing to trust her heart even when it led her places her mind couldn't follow. And as the first stars began to appear in the darkening Montana sky, Isabella Claire Williams, soon to be something else entirely, someone else entirely, closed her eyes and let herself believe in fairy tales that came disguised as broken-down ranches and desperate fathers and little girls who knew, somehow, that she had always been meant to stay.